Hello and welcome to today's webinar, The Applications of Foreign Language Learning and Learning How to Code. Now we're excited to get to the conversation today, but we have a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. So the sound for today's presentation should come from your computer and not a dial-in. If you run into any problems, try refreshing the browser and see if that helps. And sometimes rejoining the presentation will fix that problem as well. We'll answer questions towards the end of today's presentation, and to submit your question, click the question mark icon that's on the right side of your screen. And we are recording this, and we'll share the recording with everyone here in a few days. We're joined today by Kristen Foster-Mark, who has a background in teaching English as a second language and is going to talk to us about the principles of second language acquisition. Now, Kristen is also a software engineer, so she knows a thing or two about programming languages as well. And today we're going to learn about how those two things connect. So how are you doing today, Kristen?
Hi, Jeremy. Hi, Carla. I'm doing good. Thank you. Excited to be here.
Awesome. So tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Yeah, totally. So I'm currently the director of engineering for one of our engineering teams here at Pluralsight. We work on the Flow product. So that's kind of the day job. I've been doing software engineering for I think almost 6 years now. Was a teacher before, as you mentioned, was teaching English as a second or foreign language at Colorado State University, and ended up enrolling in a coding boot camp. 6-month immersive, and the rest is history. Have been doing software engineering ever since. I always like to tell people that I was a Pluralsight and a Flow fangirl before I started working here. I begged to be hired, and luckily they they let me work here. So that was about 2 years ago, and I'm just love writing code.
Nice. Yeah, it's pretty easy to get hooked on that sort of thing. And yeah, that was the same thing for me too. I was a huge Pluralsight fan before ever coming here. So it's like really cool. And we have Carla Wright with us. How are you today, Carla?
Good. How are you guys doing?
Doing well.
Great.
Doing awesome. So can you, Kristen, could you tell us a little bit about what you were doing before you became a software engineer?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's see. So in my 20s, I fled the country in 2008. I graduated with my undergraduate degree right into the recession. And so there really were no jobs here. So I ended up going over to South Korea for a couple years. And I'd always loved English. I'd always loved linguistics. It's relatively easy to get a job teaching English to Korean students if you're a native speaker of English. So I ended up doing that for a couple years and absolutely loved it. I didn't realize how much I liked the actual teaching part of it. So after my couple years there, I ended up coming back to the States and got my master's degree in English with an emphasis in teaching English as a second or a foreign language. So that was a 2-year degree. When I graduated out of that program, I stayed at CSU. I taught both in the English department, teaching college composition courses, mostly to non-native English speakers. So, international students would have special sections just for those students because their writing needs are so unique because it's not their native language. And I also spent some time teaching, just like straight up ESL courses in the intensive English program on campus. That's what I was doing before I got into coding. I like to be really frank with people. Being an adjunct instructor is not something that one can do to kind of support themselves really well financially. I think it's no secret that adjuncts kind of get taken advantage of. We're asked to work 60, 70-hour weeks for at the time I was making about $32,000 a year, 60, 70-hour weeks. Very little room for career advancement. My husband at the time, he had gone from teaching to a career in programming. So I got to see him go from kind of zero to hero, knowing no code to all of a sudden he's managing competing offers from companies for, 2-3 times what I was making at the university. And I thought, well, hell, if Aaron can do it, I can do it, right? Actually, he told me that. He's like, if I can do it, you can do it, Kristen. So yeah, I just kind of started to play around and experiment, and that's when I, decided to do the boot camp. And it was at that point, going through the boot camp where I really started to understand, like, not just the analogies between human languages and programming languages, because people have been singing that song for decades. I mean, computer languages are very similar to human languages, by design, by nature. So that's not an original idea, but I think it was just seeing how the principles of second language acquisition, like the ways that we know that we learn languages and the ways that we know that we don't learn languages, based on all of this research, this decades of research that's been done, just kind of seeing how those principles came into play while I was learning a programming language was just really exciting. It was super exciting. And I've continued to just see those as I've gone from a beginning programming language learner to an intermediate, like a mid-level, and then like up to a senior, like more advanced. It's like those principles just keep coming into play. And so, yeah, I've kind of gotten to the point where I want other people to know, what these connections are, so that, hopefully can help people learn programming languages a little bit more efficiently.
Yeah, definitely. And so how does that work? Like when you're in, say, South Korea and you're teaching English as a second language, is there a translator there that helps? Or is it something where you have to learn as you go and try to pick up as much as you can to do that initial communication?
That's a great question. So I was in what's called a hagwon. It's a Korean word for essentially it's a private academy. And so it was an English hagwon. It was an English private academy. And I was working with students in the elementary school and the middle school age range. And so these students would, go to their primary school all day long. And then after school, they would come to the academy where they would, have maybe 3 or 4 different short courses that they would take with us. Some of those courses would be taught by a native speaking Korean teacher. And then some of them would be taught by an English native speaking foreign teacher. So like I was the English native speaking foreign teacher in that context. And the rule at the hagwon was nobody speaks anything but English.
Oh, that's interesting.
So the students know, depending on their level, they know enough English by that point, typically, that, basic communication can happen. And for the really young ones, like really, you're just kind of teaching them letters and numbers and, just the beginning stages of the language. And then we're using our hands a lot, more than actual words. But no, it really is, for those couple hours that the students are at the private academy, it's an immersive experience for them. So, the idea is that they hear and they speak and they read and they write nothing but English to provide that immersive experience.
Nice. Yeah, that does kind of remind me of coding a little bit, in that when you have someone that's kind of learned a little bit of a language and then you dump them into a position where you're like, you have to write the language now and you have to jump into other people's code. Then after a while, they start to pick it up just by being, immersed in it, rather than here's a book, come back in 6 months and you'll be a C programmer or whatever.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely.
Were there any?
I have a question really quick.
Yeah.
So coming from the other end of the point of view, quick background for everybody. So I got a bachelor's in English, taught ESL students myself for SAT, ACT prep, and we were talking about immersion, where we're teaching classes only in English, and, this is obviously their second language. So how you mentioned that you just kind of learned, you just picked the boot camp and went for coding, like, how do you find out or figure out, like, what's the right type of boot camp to kind of mimic that type of immersion for people to start learning coding?
Yeah, Carla, that's a really good question. So, at that time, and I think it's probably the same today, boot camps will essentially advertise themselves as immersive if they are really providing that immersive experience. So I've seen boot camps that are 6 months to 12 months, but maybe, like a 6-hour commitment in the evenings throughout that 6 months or year, not an immersive experience. I signed up for the Galvanize immersive full stack program. And so like they let you know right from the start, like you're going to be programming for 12 to 16 hours a day. Don't try to have a job while you're doing this. Don't try to do anything else while you're doing this. This is immersive. And it really was that way. I mean, I would get up at 5 a.m, drink my coffee, start coding. And I would be coding until essentially I went to bed that night.
Wow.
So, and on the weekends, and that's not sustainable, but going into it, I knew, okay, this is my life for 6 months. And, I think we'll talk a little bit more about motivation, and that being, an aspect of language learning and a necessary aspect of kind of successful language learning. But I really needed to have good motivation to persist through those 6 months of complete immersion. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, again, like some boot camps are like a year and a lower commitment. Some are 3 months and even a higher commitment. I've seen some that are like 3 months, you stay here, you sleep here, you never leave. You'll sleep for 6 hours a night and you'll be a full stack engineer by the end of it. That doesn't work for me in my brain, but for some people, like some people can do that in 3 months.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I imagine they have a lot of caffeine at that location.
You would think so, right?
They would have to.
And no keg. Hopefully no keg. A lot of these
Yeah.
are like, we have a keg on campus. I don't know how that helps learning. I don't think it does, but
Probably not. Probably pulls you in the other direction, I'd imagine.
Yep.
Awesome. So is there any research currently being done for the SLA, the connection between SLA with language and with programming languages?
Not that I have been able to find. So I want to say no, very little. However, there's always a possibility that I've lost all of my research skills that I learned as a graduate student, but I don't think so. There was a paper that was published in 1995. I forget the journal. It was a computer science kind of journal, and it was essentially a paper calling for the melding of these two fields. SLA and computer science programming language pedagogy, essentially. It is the only article that I have found when I've been researching in the scholarly databases. I have found a few articles coming out of Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Florida. They seem to have a research program that's kind of spinning up. I think, and I could be wrong, 2015, 2016, I think is the first time that they started publishing when those first papers came out. But that's all that I've been able to find. So if anybody on this call knows of anything, please tell me, because I've been looking for this. And I think especially, with that 1995 paper that came out proposing that, a research program be stood up around this. It's just surprising to me that it hasn't happened.
Yeah, because it does seem like there's a lot of parallels. Like when I first started learning programming, I learned with C and I struggled with it. I'll be perfectly honest that I struggled for months and months before I could build anything, because every concept was completely foreign. Like what's a variable, what's a switch, what's an operator, extremely foreign. But you fast forward to now, if a language looks enough like C, I'll be able to pick it up and start moving really fast. If it doesn't, and we're talking decades here, which is like embarrassing to admit, but if it looks like C, I can just pick it up and start rolling. But if it's completely different from C, then I'm still kind of back to that. Okay, how does this work? How does this work? And is there some similarities there with languages? Like if you're learning another Romantic language or Germanic language or something like that, being a little bit easier than something completely different from English?
I'm glad you asked that, because I was going to bring it up anyways, because as you were talking about that, I was like, oh my gosh, okay, there's this whole area of SLA that looks at language similarities between different languages and how so L1 is SLA terminology for your native language. So my native language is English. It's my L1. L2 is your second language, or your third, or your fourth, or your fifth, or whatever. So it's just kind of like L2 is the acronym to refer to that. So if your L1 is very similar grammatically and has an overlapping lexicon vocabulary with your L2, then the research shows that you will pick up that language more quickly and more efficiently, which makes sense, right? It kind of seems like common sense, but we know that, like, what is common sense really? We need to test these assumptions, and a lot of researchers have done a lot of studies testing that assumption, and it really is easier. I mean, the three of us were talking earlier about Russian. Yeah. And how different the Russian language is than English. And we were talking about Mandarin and how different Mandarin is than English. And we were talking about Spanish. All three of us have studied Spanish, right?
Yep.
Well, I mean, I'm going to go on a limb and say that Spanish has been the easiest language for me to pick up because of its similarities to English. They don't come from the same family, but English has a strong Latin influence. So that makes Spanish a little bit easier for us. I picked up some Korean while I was in Korea. And while the writing system is relatively easy to learn, grammatically, it's very different than English. And I mean, I never broke out of that beginner level in Korean. I think because the grammatical structures are so disparate than English grammatical structures. So Jeremy, like your comments about programming languages, that some are just so different than others, and that when you have to kind of learn a language that has a much different syntactic structure than the ones you've learned before, that those are more challenging. That really resonates. I was actually just talking to one of my colleagues about that yesterday. We were looking at some Java code, trying to troubleshoot a library that we needed for this other thing to work. And we were like, oh my gosh, we don't know Java. It's very different than JavaScript and Python, the languages that we do know. And it just adds that little bit of extra processing time.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes, there's a little bit of curse of knowledge going on there too, where, like if I jump into Java, and I have before, it's very similar to C#, which is a language I know well. Some people would argue because C# totally ripped off Java, but that's entirely another conversation. But I will jump into Java and start doing things and start making all these assumptions, and then it doesn't work. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. I don't know Java, even though it looks very, very similar. Yes. What I just tried to do is not working, and I have no idea why. And
time to go to the docs.
Yeah, it's almost like if I jumped in there without the C# knowledge, I might get farther almost.
Yeah. Well, and it's nice that you've got the I don't know how C# compiles, but like you have an interpreter to tell you, hey, this is not how this language works, right? Like you see an error message, and usually you get a nice little hint about what to change to make it work. Not always the same when we're learning human languages, right? Like especially if you're learning on your own, you don't have an interlocutor always to say, "Ooh, you didn't say that quite correctly," or "I don't understand. Can you say that differently?" Which kind of like helps us inch towards fluency in a way, right? I do think that programming languages are easier to learn than human languages. This is controversial. Some people have gotten angry with me when I've said that, but I do think they are, and that's one of the reasons why I think that to gain advanced fluency in a human language, you really need other people to interact with and interlocutors. And learning programming languages, we do need that, I think, to get to senior level. But the computer will tell us most of the time when we're making a mistake.
So that might be one of the innovations in the language space at some point, where you'll have it, and maybe they already exist now. I don't know, I'm a little bit ignorant to this area, but maybe to where you can start speaking to an application and the app can come back and say, nope, you didn't conjugate that verb correctly, or these are out of place, and kind of act as a compiler or interpreter to spit it back. That might be a new way of learning.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, Grammarly, are you both familiar with the Grammarly plugin?
Yeah, I use that all the
Yeah.
time.
Oh my God, it's
Yeah.
amazing. It's amazing.
Yes.
I looked at their job boards before because I was just curious. I was like, man, they have to employ a lot of natural language processing specialists, NLP specialists, and they do. I
Yeah.
mean, I remember I wasn't going to go try to work there because I don't have those programming skills. But it was all NLP specialists that they were hiring, which makes sense because I mean, they analyze a piece of text and tell you, give you lots of suggestions, right? I don't know if we have any programs yet where you can like where they're analyzing that audible input, but textual for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, very
Yeah.
cool. So yeah, that was one of the questions that I had, is what you think is harder. And Carla, have you tried to learn any programming languages yet?
You know,
I know I've been pushing you to do it.
So if you can see right here, I have HTML5.
There you go.
Oh, I love it. Carla, that's the first step. That's amazing.
Listen, my
Yeah.
experience started with MySpace. You know, I wanted to add some cool music and background and pictures type of thing. And it kind of forced you into that. Obviously, there's been some, you know, expansion on HTML since that time point. But to me, I feel like if I don't study it every single day, I have to go back and reread the chapter again because it doesn't, how Jeremy's like, oh, I can look at if it looks similar to like C+, I can, you know, kind of figure it out. That's kind of how I feel like if I look at German, for instance, you know, like it's like, oh, Apfel or, you know, Kinder, or, you know, like, oh, we're talking about apples and kids. Cool, got it. You know, like I can make the connection much easier with the languages than I can with the coding, because I feel like the coding, I need to be immersed 24/7. Otherwise, it just goes out the window. Like I don't remember it. The short-term memory just completely fails me on that end. So it's interesting to see that Jeremy can look at coding and kind of figure it out if it's similar. Whereas, and for me, I can look at languages, you know, with Spanish and a little bit of German and put it together too. And, you know, I'm like, it's pretty close to what I'm thinking about, you know, so I can like pick up a paper and be like, oh, they're talking, I think, about schools and kids or something like that. And it kind of makes sense a little bit more than the coding does. Because to me, it's like I look at the coding and all I see is lines.
Symbols.
But I'm sure some people feel about like music too. Like I can look at sheet music and I'm like, oh yeah, we're in like C major, or you know, we're in like,
Oh, amazing.
you know, because like that I can look at and do no problem. But coding for me is just completely, I feel like my brain does not make that connection there.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Carla, I would say like that is absolutely not a personal failing. I think it's just like you haven't yet had enough exposure to HTML and to those languages that it's stuck, right?
Yeah.
Which makes sense. Like if you were to go study, if you were to study Korean, because they use a different set of symbols, they don't use the Roman symbol set. I mean, if you studied for 10 minutes once a week for a year, like your learning would probably be slow because every week you'd have to kind of remind yourself of what those symbols are, right?
Yes.
I think that's probably analogous to learning how to code for people who haven't been exposed to it yet.
I wonder if there's a way, because you know how when you're learning a second language, so for instance, we'll just go back to German because it's on my head. So if I pick up an apple, I know it's apple in English. I know in German it's Apfel, but sometimes we may put like stickers on it that say like Apfel. And so I know how to spell it. And I know that, you know, in English, like I know it's apple, but I'm learning German. So it's just a reminder where I put like notes everywhere, like this is called this and this is called that. Is there a way to immerse yourself in coding like that, where you can kind of like make that type of connection?
I think so. Jeremy, I think, is a more accomplished programmer than I am. So Jeremy, what are your thoughts on that? I have some ideas, but I'm curious to know how you've approached that as a really successful multi-programming language learner.
I think, yeah, definitely you have that same kind of mindset. I think I build kind of a mental model in my head of what I think the data structures look like and what I want them to do. And unfortunately, I'm not artistic enough to draw it out, but it's at least in my head. And so when I'll go to a new language and start thinking about the flow and how things are are moving and how the data structures are set up. Usually I do kind of look in my head and be like, okay, this is what it looks like in C#, or, this is what it looks like in Python. So I think it's going to look this way in Golang, and kind of go through that way. But yeah, there's definitely something similar to, if you're trying to learn a new language, you want to stare at this object and you don't want to tell yourself this is an apple. You want to say this is an apple and start, kind of thinking in that language, I guess you would say. And that's what I try to do with new languages to varying levels of success. I try to think in that language as much as I can as I'm learning it, if that makes any sense. And part of the idioms is where you get tripped up a lot in programming languages. And that makes me think that speaking languages would be magnitudes harder to learn because of all those idioms. Like I can look at C# code and see that someone's written and it works and it compiles and it runs, but I can look at it and be like, this is a JavaScript programmer. I can tell because they're putting in var something everywhere. And look at it and be like, this is, or this was a Python programmer. You can look at it just because of those idioms, and it's not incorrect. It's just, this is how things were done in JavaScript, and they've carried it kind of over. And I imagine with spoken languages, it's probably the same way, where people probably instinctively know what language you came from based on the way you say certain things, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. I had that experience. So the programming language that I learned to program with was JavaScript. And then I'm using Python now. And JavaScript is not as, I guess, as mature of a language as Python is in a lot of ways. And, for those in the audience who haven't started learning or just in beginning stages, these languages are not static. They are constantly being improved and added upon. So, we'll see different versions of, or new versions of programming languages come out, typically, once every 1 or 2 years for a lot of them. But I remember, moving from JavaScript to Python, and there were so many ways in which I was writing my Python code, Jeremy, like idiomatically from a JavaScript perspective, right? And I would get feedback and feedback from people saying, oh, Kristen, like there's a much easier way to do this in Python. Like you kind of like wrote this super manually. Python has this really awesome language feature that we can use to simplify this, to make it more readable, to make it more performant. And that was something that I was not expecting as a beginning programmer, was that that all of these languages are not exactly the same, and they're not at the same level of maturity.
Yeah. That is actually a good point, because there's a lot of it within the same language. There's been times that I've written things and had code reviews from other people, and we're like, we don't do it that way anymore. Like that was correct a few years ago, but we don't check out this new thing, and then I'll be like, oh wow, cool. Okay.
Yeah.
But to that point, is there like rules that never change, like a basis of rules? Like, so for instance, to the point that Kristen, what you were talking about with languages, when I was teaching, like I said, I had a lot of Mandarin students, and they basically told me at the very basis of learning the language, there was like a set rule set. Like for instance, the noun always comes first, and then the preposition, and then the verb. I don't mean to offend anybody if that's the wrong order, but it was something like that, where there was like the noun was first, the preposition was next, verb, and then, but obviously the verbiage itself could change, but that rule itself never changed. So it makes me think, is there something like that too to coding?
Yes, exactly. And we actually use the same word. So syntax is a linguistic word that we use to refer to, like it's a fancy word for grammar, right? Yeah. Programming languages also have syntax. And when we break those rules, again, the computer yells at us, right? Like we get a little error in our terminal saying, nope, you can't write it that way, which is really amazing. And again, it's like one of the reasons why I think that learning to program can be a little bit easier than learning human languages, because that computer is just gonna like let you know when you broke the rules. Yep.
Definitely.
Yeah. But at the same time, just like human languages, there's room for style too. So, we talk about like coding patterns, and we talk about code styles. And in fact, teams of software engineers can often get in kind of heated debates about the ways in which they want to write things. Jeremy, I see you nodding. I'm one of those programmers that I'm just like, you know what? Like, if you have a strong opinion about how, what style rules you think we should follow, I'm good with it. I'm still learning. But a lot of people are super opinionated that no, we should write it this way instead of this way, even though both are syntactically correct. Neither is going to throw an error. And I think it's the same in writing. Like, people will kind of fall on their swords over, like, this is the correct way to craft a resume, right? A resume is a genre that has some rules, and we have the ability to follow or break some of those rules, and people get very opinionated about it. It's the same with software, both at kind of that sentential level and that bigger like program level, or kind of like what I would call like the genre level or textual level.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because like when I got started as a developer, I was always trying to be clever, and I'm sure most developers go through this, and I try to build something that's just really clever and cool and put this together. And then some of the senior people would be like, that's not readable. Yes, it works. Okay, it's clever, it's neat, but it's not readable. We can't understand what you're trying to do. And so later in my career, I'm writing code for humans instead of the compiler, which is a lot of what people are talking about now. A lot of the senior folks will say, write for humans, for other people to read it. And I would think languages could be the exact same way. Like, I could try to get really fancy and use $10 words for everything and have somebody start halfway through the paragraph, like, I'm out. So, got to write something that humans can read and understand. So
absolutely. And we're seeing a movement in that very vein. Have you heard of the plain English movement?
I have, actually, where they talk about and I don't remember for some reason now I can't remember the index.
Yeah, it's like, it's kind of in the legal and like government policy arena. We have the word legalese to refer to the kind of writing that is just rife with legal terms. And if you examine the grammatical structure of a lot of legal writing and legal documents, it's very sophisticated, which is great. That's fine. There's a place for that kind of writing, but it's not human readable for 99% of us, right? And so there's this whole movement. It's called the plain English movement. Like, let's rip out the legalese, which only this very small subset of people can understand quickly and fully, and let's replace it with plain English, so that everybody can understand the documents that they're signing and the laws that they're breaking, or whatever it is you're analyzing.
These are the rules.
Yes, yep, yeah. So definitely, I think a clear analogy there between writing style and coding style.
Yeah, definitely.
Interesting.
So, Kristen, what advice would you give to new programmers as they learn programming languages for the first time? Like, given your experience.
So I have a couple big pieces of advice. I think these are the ones that I think are most important. The first piece of advice I have is remember that coding and like programming languages are something that you read, you write, and you speak, and you listen to, and you hear. So just like in human languages, when we're studying a human language, we differentiate between the 4 skills, the 2 receptive skills and the 2 productive skills. It's the same with programming, not always in the beginning, but you have to write code. You have to read code to gain fluency, right? And then when you enter the professional sphere, you have to read the code that came before you and the code of your peers. So like, reading code is its own skill. You have to be able to hear people talk about code and understand what they're saying. Oftentimes I am jumping on a call with one of my teammates, either asking for help or giving help and feedback, and they're describing what they're trying to do, and they're describing the coding features or mechanisms that they're using to get the job done. And they have to be able to speak it so that I can understand it, and I have to be able to listen and understand it. So kind of going back to that piece of advice of like, remember that you really do have these 4 skills that you need to work on. Don't just sit there and try to write code. Remember that there are the other 3 as well. And that really is based in research that folks in the second language acquisition sphere have done around what kind of activities we need to engage in to reach ultimate attainment, or that true fluency. There are so many vignettes of people who say things like, "Ooh, yeah, I can read French. Like I can read novels in French, but I can't speak it, and I can't understand it. I can't understand other people who are speaking it, but I can read it." And you know, with the other skills, like some people can hear it, but they absolutely cannot write it. Like that is a thing that happens, and that happens because we focus too much on one of those skills, or we ignore, you know, 1 or 2 of them entirely. So to be a professional programmer, you have to be able to do all 4 of them. So I think it's just good advice to just get used to that right from the beginning. Second biggest piece of advice is to know what your motivation is. And this isn't necessarily specific to learning human languages or learning programming languages. You know, motivation is something that is wildly interdisciplinary. Every academic discipline has its own little, you know, subsection of motivation research, it seems like. But there's one theory that has come out of the SLA research that has really resonated with me. There's a Hungarian psycholinguist. He's got the best name. His name is Zoltán Dornier.
Nice.
Yes, and he has specialized in motivation. He's written the books on language learning motivation, and he has this theory. It's called the ideal L2 self, and there's 3 components to that. His belief that is born out through the research is that as a language learner, we need to have a clear image in our minds of like who we are with that skill that we desire to develop, or with that language proficiency. So like, for example, if I decide, you know what, I miss Korea. I want to go live in Korea. Like, I don't just want to live there for a year or 2. I want to live in Korea. Well, to gain fluency in Korean, if I can keep this image in my mind of, you know, this expatriate who, you know, walks the streets of Korea and is able to, you know, chat with my neighbors in Korean and maybe get a job at a company where nobody, like people aren't speaking English, like Korean is a language. If I can imagine myself doing the things and being the person, you know, with this Korean language fluency, the theory is that I will better be able to persist through the challenges of learning Korean. And same with programming languages. And I'm actually experiencing this right now because I'm trying to level up in Python, and finding time to do that is challenging, right? I think everyone can relate to that. It's
Absolutely
challenging to find time for that. So I've really been focusing on like, okay, like who is Kristen as a badass senior Python software engineer? And I can like picture myself, you know, like mentoring other engineers and like being one of the people on an engineering team who like is gone to help solve problems, and somebody who can mentor people just getting into the field because I like have this language expertise, right? Like that's what I keep thinking of. Like I want to be that person, and just knowing that like that's who I want to be it's working. Like I can say like I'm in the midst of this right now and it's working. It's helping me kind of persist through some of the drudgery that is involved in you know, becoming an expert in a particular language. So, and, you know, another part of that L2 motivational self theory is the ought to self. So I ought to have these skills. I ought to know this language. And that's a little bit more like avoidance based than the ideal self. The ideal self is more like self-actualization driven, right? The ought to self is more like, okay, I'm avoiding the negative repercussions of not having these skills. And I've been there too. I wanted to get out of the teaching realm. I wanted to make more than $32,000 a year. And I thought, well, I ought to become a programmer to do that. That really helped me persist through that 6-month immersive experience. I didn't want to stay in the teaching field and have that life. And I knew that if I could get to the other end of that boot camp, then, I would be a different person with a different life trajectory. And then the third part of that is just kind of the importance of the linguistic environment and the learning environment. So, there's an entire subsection of SLA that focuses on the linguistic environment. There's a lot of different components of that. But Dornier and his colleagues have determined that really is a really important part of sustaining motivation through the hard task of learning another language.
Yeah, that's a really good viewpoint. I hadn't really considered that before. Because I've been on both sides of that, where like when I was learning .NET and stuff, I like envisioned myself being this .NET programmer, like all the ones that I was working with who are just building all this cool stuff day after day. And, every 2 weeks they're showing off these demos and look at us. And I'm like, that's what I want to be. That's what I want to do. And then when I had to learn front end development to go with the back end stuff years later, I'm like, I really need to learn JavaScript and front end, and I better do it. And yeah, definitely different attitude and different learning patterns.
Yes,
you had which one I'm better at today.
Yes, you had your ideal self with the .NET skills and your ought to self with the front end skills, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Absolutely.
Yep. Well, and we could probably have a whole hour-long conversation about specializing in the software engineering field, in the computer space. Luckily, we can specialize and we can say, ooh, this is what I really want to do, and stick to that. Like those jobs do exist. But sometimes you land on a team and it's like your team needs you to build something and there's nobody else to build it and there's no time to hire someone. And so, you have to learn a language or a framework because you ought to for the benefit of your team, right? And it can be hard to sustain motivation through those kinds of work tasks.
Yeah. So would that ought to mentality apply to like learning full stack then?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, because Carla, when I went into the boot camp, which was a full stack boot camp, to kind of use that terminology, I knew that I ought to learn both sides because I had no idea which I was going to like better. And It was only after a few years doing full stack professionally that I was like, oh, front end makes me kind of want to, I'd rather be on the back end side. And it's so funny because some people are just the opposite. Yeah. I actually think front end is harder than back end, so that's probably why. CSS, woo!
So one of the ways that I like to get people motivated is telling them to build a project, like something that they care about, something that, build something to organize your vinyl records and write it in Python. And as you're doing that, you'll start learning Python more and you'll have more motivation. Do you think there's a parallel there with spoken languages, like being able to go to the Korean store and ordering bread or something? I don't know.
Yep, absolutely. And in fact, so so two things I'll touch on. So 60 years ago, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago, the really common activity that teachers, language teachers, human language teachers would give their students was translating these like really old texts, right? So if you were learning English in the 1940s, your teacher probably gave you a grammar translation exercise. That is not an authentic language task. When outside of that classroom, do you ever have to do that to like do something productive with the language? It's just not an authentic exercise, right? So over the decades, people kind of started to realize this, and then research popped up around, okay, well, what are the kinds of activities that lead to successful, I'm just going to say successful, like doing of the language, whether that be speaking it or writing it, like whatever you're learning and using that language for. What do we do in the classroom to help people get to that point? And so like to do that, you need to look at what the ultimate goal is, and craft authentic exercises to help you be able to do that thing. And this is like general like education pedagogy stuff, right? Like it's not specific to language learning. I think we've known for a long time that that we need authentic learning tasks, right? But I think that building an application from scratch with Python is an amazing exercise, because you really might have to do that on your job. One of the first tasks that I had at my previous company was to stand up a microservice from scratch. And that is essentially just, I was using Node, using JavaScript, and that is essentially just like building an application from scratch. Learned how to do that in my boot camp. So I knew how to do it. And it took me longer than it would take a senior engineer, but it was an authentic task that they gave us in the boot camp that really helped me succeed in my job, my later job. So there's that. And then there's also, I think related to that, there is this thing called languages for specific purposes. So we talk about English for specific purposes. And the idea is that human languages are vast, and it takes people years and years and sometimes decades to gain complete fluency, if they ever even get to that point. It's relatively, it's not common to actually get to complete fluency in a second, third, or fourth language. And so, like, let's take a look at what specific purpose the person needs the language for. So let me think of an example. Okay, so like at CSU, at Colorado State University, they offered an English for specific purposes class. I think it was a couple nights a week for non-native English speakers who were working in restaurants and kitchens in the Fort Collins area. And so the vocabulary that was covered, even like the grammatical structures that were covered, they were very specific to that restaurant context. Because these learners didn't need to do everything with the language. They just needed to do things with the language that were specific to that context. And it's the same with programming languages. I don't need to know every language, and I don't need to know every Python framework. And I don't need to know everything that you can do with Python, but I do need to know what I need to know for my job, right? And so it really makes sense for me to focus my time and my energy and my brain power on learning those things. I'm learning Python, and I'm learning pieces of Python for a specific purpose.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, someone just posted a link in chat to medicalspanish.com.
Yes. Yes. I love it.
An amazing application right there.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's funny that you brought that up, Kristen, because from a second language point of view, like the question that Jeremy asked, having moved to Salt Lake from Miami, if anybody here has ever visited Miami, we always joke that you need a passport because billboards are in Spanish and everybody speaks Spanish. And if you walk into a restaurant, they just kind of assume you speak Spanish. So, yes. And as you can see, I look very much Spanish, but English is my first language. So my Spanish speaking friends would always be like, hey, if you don't know what to say, just go in there and be like, yo quiero uno eso, and just point at what you want if you don't know the name. And that would usually take me just as far. And I think people kind of thought in the back of the head that I might have been a little slow or something, just because I didn't know the name of it. But it was one of those, like, I just needed to skirt by just enough to order what I wanted and then just smile at you and go about my day type of thing. And that's kind of where second language made me think of that memory.
Definitely. Oh my gosh, Carla, that resonates with me so much, just thinking about like some of my travel experiences. And I remember like in my early 20s, when I was traveling around, I would think, oh my gosh, I'm not going to be able to like be in this country unless I'm fluent. Yeah. And that is just so not the case. I actually just gave one of my coworkers some advice a couple of weeks ago. She wants to go to Japan. And she doesn't know any Japanese. And she said, Kristen, where do I start? And I said, honestly, I was like, think about the situations that you're going to be in as a tourist in that country. And think about the things that you're going to need to ask for and ask for help for. I know it's cliche, but you are going to need to ask where the bathroom is. So make sure that you can say that, and also that you can understand potential responses to that, right? You're going to have to ask where the subway is. So make sure you can ask for it and receive the response. You don't need to know, how to make your way through a job interview in Japanese if you're going there for a couple weeks.
Definitely.
Yep.
So do we want to start taking some questions?
Yeah, that sounds great. I'm excited for these questions.
Yeah, there's questions in the Q&A, and there's been a bunch of questions in the chat. So it's wherever you want to start.
Yeah. And do you want to read those off, Carla, or do you want me?
Why don't you start with the Q&A, Jeremy?
Oh. All right. So Alessa, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, says, what are your thoughts on the gamification of the learning process, either verbal languages or coding languages like Duolingo for verbal and Grasshopper for coding? So what do you think of the gamification of the learning process?
I love it. I love it. I mean, gamification is all about dopamine. We know that dopamine is a motivator, right? Kind of a subconscious motivator. And I think that there's a reason that we're seeing gamification across many, many different kinds of learning tasks, and even beyond learning tasks. And that's because it works. Like it works for a lot of people, and it doesn't seem to work for everyone. But if you know that that works for you and that you're motivated by seeing those badges pile up, then heck yeah, like we should be tapping into that system where we can, and again, if you know that it's effective for you. Absolutely. So I love it. And I love getting badges on a personal level.
I do too. One of the things I like about Pluralsight, and I don't want to sound like an ad, but I love skill IQ, because there's certain things that I've got in there that skill IQ has been so low. I'm like, yeah, I definitely need to focus on this pretty hard.
Oh my gosh. Amen, Jeremy. I do the same thing. Sometimes I take skill IQs for things I know absolutely nothing about, just so that I can see like the jump when I do finally learn that thing. Yeah, it's satisfying. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yep.
Let's see. And David asks, you mentioned Spanish is the easiest foreign language to learn. What would you say is the easiest programming language to start with?
Good question. So I'm going to clarify. Spanish, of all of the languages that I personally have studied, Spanish has been the easiest for me. So I don't know if there's any consensus on what the easiest language to learn. And I actually don't even think we can answer that question for human languages because of that L1 influence factor. Well, what is an easy language for a native speaker of English might not be an easy language for a native speaker of Russian. So just to clarify that. In terms of easiest programming language to get started with, I think that JavaScript and Python are kind of universally accepted as two of the best languages to get started with. JavaScript in particular has extremely friendly documentation and a very robust community of learners all the way up to like advanced like JavaScript practitioners. So there's this huge community of people who are willing to help you and give you feedback. And I also, from my limited experience, I've only been doing this for 6 years, but I think that the tools that we use to write JavaScript are very user-friendly in relation to other languages like Java. I've never written in Java, but I do know that you have to go through a compilation process. You have to have special tools on your machine to even start writing Java code. Jeremy, am I right on that? That's what I've heard. So it's a little bit more challenging to get set up to even start writing code than with something like JavaScript or Python. So those would be my personal recommendations. Jeremy, would you recommend something different?
The exact recommendations, actually. I think JavaScript and Python, for all of the reasons that you stated, like there's a huge community, there's a bunch of data on it. And like almost any computer in the world will run JavaScript because you can put it in an HTML page and click it and load it up on your desktop. So yeah, exactly like you're saying, you don't have big, huge tool chains to set up and configure. And JavaScript is also C-based, like I mentioned earlier. It's kind of loosely based on C, and I might get flamed for saying that, but it's similar enough that if you want to move to other languages, they will make more sense. And then Python, I think, is just, you get a lot done with not a lot of code, and that keeps you motivated and keeps you going. So as you're doing Python, you're like, I can't believe that I just did all of these things with this much code, and then like, I want to do more. So
it's amazing. Python is such a fun language. I love Python. Yeah.
It is awesome.
Yep.
Let's see. I have a long question here that I'll read off. There are some pretty obvious parallels between coding and language, such as syntax, vocabulary, punctuation, etc. That said, at its heart, coding is logic, which is more closely related to math, a subject that's often portrayed as being on the opposite side of the learning spectrum. How do you reconcile that, in your opinion? Is that where the parallels break down, or is there a different take?
No, I actually don't think the parallels break down there. Logicians deal in both math and language. Ask any philosopher whether, languages have a heavy logic-based component, and they do. I'm not really qualified enough to speak, I think, beyond those generalities. But yeah, my belief, my answer is that the analogy doesn't break down there. Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think I think we can actually kind of test that theory too, around the idea that like we can read code. My team does group code reviews sometimes. And so we actually ask someone to drive and to take us through the new code and to tell us what it's doing. And so we're actually like using English to describe the logic. And so I think just the fact that you can use human language to describe mathematical logic or coding logic is probably all the proof we need to say that, that the analogy is clear there.
Yeah, I would agree. And that actually goes to a really good debugging tool that you can use, which is a little rubber duck on your desk, and they call it rubber duck debugging. Is you just explain to that rubber duck what you're doing. And it sounds completely silly, but I adopted it years ago, and I swear by it. I'll have like a little rubber duck, or there's this little wizard, which I can't find it on my desk right now, but I probably ran off somewhere. But there's this little wizard that came from a software company from a talk they did. And sometimes I'll just start talking to this wizard and be like, I'm trying to put this together, and I'm taking this and I'm serializing it here. And yeah, I look silly, but then after a while, after you put it into language, it's like, oh, I think I know what I did wrong.
Yes, absolutely. I love that. I love that. And we see it play out like when we're with another person coding, and we say, okay, help me find the flaw in my logic here. And then you say it and somebody helps you. And then it's like, oh my God, yeah, thank you, obviously. But sometimes it's just, voicing it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yep.
All right. Well, it looks like we're at time here. Is there any final thoughts you'd like to give anyone about SLA research or coding in spoken languages? Any kind of final thoughts, I guess, for the audience?
I guess maybe my final thought was, we didn't have much of a chance to talk about beliefs about language learning, which is a whole subsection of SLA. And again, it's very interdisciplinary. We have beliefs about learning lots of different things. So we have beliefs about how language learning best unfolds. We have beliefs about how one should learn how to ride a bike, right? I think that we have beliefs about how to best learn a coding language and how to program. And we have beliefs about what works and what doesn't work, and the kinds of activities we should be doing and the kinds that we shouldn't. And I would just encourage, everyone who is stepping into this field, or if you've been in the field for a long time and you want to go to the next level with a language or learn a new language, examine your beliefs and be honest with yourself about whether those are mythologies that you've been entertaining. Like, do you have actual evidence that belief is valid? Or are you holding a limiting belief as something that's actually impeding your acquisition and your learning or your motivation, stuff like that. So that would be my closing thought. thousands, millions, hundreds of millions of people have learned a second or foreign language and how to code, and you can do it too.
Awesome.
Believe that you can do it.
That's a great message. So how can folks get a hold of you if they have additional questions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm on LinkedIn. I don't do any of the other social. My dog has an Instagram, but I don't. So yeah, if anybody wants to connect on LinkedIn, I would love to. If you've got any counter arguments to anything that I said during this webinar, I would love to hear them. Still kind of developing my ideas around this whole concept, and just love to talk about it. So definitely don't hesitate to get to connect with me.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for coming. And for those who've missed it, we'll be sending out a recording to everybody. And thank you very much, Kristen, for doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. This was so fun.
Yeah, this is great. All right.
All right. Bye, everyone.
All right, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.